Millions of fans watched the Oakland Raiders build a dynasty on outlaws nobody else wanted. A franchise that turned discarded troublemakers into three Super Bowl championships between 1976 and 1983. The team's own owner called it the perfect marriage, the kind they make in hell. But when the stadium lights went out for the last time, the Renegades who made the Raiders silver and black mean something found out exactly what that marriage cost. Brain disease, steroid-fueled cancer, a hit that ended two men's lives at once, decades apart. This is where the Raiders' original bad boys really ended up. One is the quarterback whose scrambling, gunslinging style revolutionized the position and whose brain became one of the most important donations in the history of football science. Ken Stabler, nicknamed the Snake for his ability to slither away from pass rushers, quarterbacked the Raiders for 10 seasons, winning the 1974 NFL MVP award and leading Oakland to victory in Super Bowl XI. Born in Foley, Alabama in 1945, Stabler led Alabama to a national championship under Bear Bryant before Oakland drafted him in the second round in 1968, and he authored some of the most famous plays in NFL history, including the Sea of Hands, Ghost to the Post, and the improvised Holy Roller fumble that beat the San Diego Chargers. In his own 1986 autobiography, Stabler wrote candidly about the Raiders' culture, describing drunk teammates pointing guns at him in the locker room and joking that Oakland was the only team in football that traveled with its own bail bondsman. Stabler retired in 1984 after stops in Houston and New Orleans, and by his 60s, his longtime partner Kim Bush noticed him struggling with headaches, confusion, and memory problems he had never had before. Ken Stabler died of colon cancer on July 8, 2015, at his home in Alabama, at age 69. Following his wishes, his family donated his brain to Boston University's CTE Center, and researchers found stage 3 chronic traumatic encephalopathy spread widely through his brain tissue, making Stabler the first prominent quarterback ever diagnosed with the disease. He was posthumously inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame the following February and buried at Pine Rest Cemetery in Foley, Alabama, the same small town where his story started. The Snake authored some of the most electric improvised plays in football history. Ken Stabler's final donation was a brain that helped prove no position on the field was ever truly safe from the game he loved. Two is the defensive lineman whose public confession about steroids became one of the sport's first and most haunting warnings, delivered from a body that had betrayed him completely. Lyle Alzado spent the final 4 seasons of his 15-year career with the Raiders helping anchor the defensive line that won Super Bowl XVIII after a decade of terrorizing quarterbacks in Denver and Cleveland with a Brooklyn street fighter's temper that once earned him an 8-round exhibition boxing match against Muhammad Ali. Born in Brooklyn in 1949 to a hard-drinking father and raised on raw aggression, Alzado attended tiny Yankton College in South Dakota before clawing his way into the NFL as a 4th-round pick, eventually becoming, according to one rival coach, exactly the kind of player only the Raiders could love. In 1991, at age 42, and attempting an ill-fated comeback, Alzado was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor. Months later, in a Sports Illustrated cover story titled "I Lied," he admitted to using anabolic steroids and human growth hormone throughout nearly his entire career, and stated flatly that he believed the drugs had caused his cancer. Doctors could never medically confirm the connection, but Alzado spent his final year touring the country anyway, warning young athletes about the drugs that built his career. Lyle Alzado died at his home in Lake Oswego, Oregon, on May 14, 1992, with his wife Kathy at his side at age 43. The Raiders called him a consummate warrior. Lyle Alzado spent his last months making sure no other kid built a body the same way he built his, even if science could never prove he was right about why it killed him. If Alzado's warning is the one that got you, tell me in the comments which member of this team hit you hardest, because the next man on this list became one half of the most notorious collision in NFL history and never spoke to the other half again. 3 is the safety whose single hit in a meaningless preseason game defined the rest of his life on both sides of the injury. Jack Tatum, nicknamed the Assassin, anchored the Raiders' secondary for 9 seasons, winning a Super Bowl in 1977 and earning 3 Pro Bowl selections with a hitting style built to intimidate receivers before the ball ever arrived. Born in Cherryville, North Carolina in 1948 and raised in New Jersey, Tatum started Ohio State under Woody Hayes before Oakland made him a first-round pick in 1971, and he was already infamous by 1972, the year his hit on Frenchie Fuqua deflected the pass that became the Immaculate Reception. On August 12, 1978, in a preseason game against the New England Patriots, Tatum delivered a legal, textbook hit on receiver Darryl Stingley that compressed Stingley's spinal cord and left him paralyzed for the remainder of his life. Tatum maintained he tried to visit Stingley in the hospital and was turned away by the family, while Stingley said Tatum never once reached out except while promoting books with titles like Final Confessions of an NFL Assassin. The two men never reconciled. Tatum developed diabetes later in life, leading to a staph infection that cost him 5 toes and eventually his entire right leg, amputated below the knee. Jack Tatum died of a heart attack on July 27, 2010, at age 61, 3 years after Stingley himself had died from complications of the same paralysis Tatum's hit had caused. The assassin authored one of the most feared hitting reputations in football history. Jack Tatum spent his final years losing pieces of his own body to diabetes, having never received or given the forgiveness that might have let either man rest easier. 4 is the defensive end so massive and unpredictable that Hollywood eventually cast him as a monster, only for real life to make the casting look almost gentle by comparison. John Matuszak, nicknamed Twos, was the first overall pick in the 1973 NFL Draft, a 6'8" giant out of the University of Tampa who bounced through 3 teams as a hellraiser before Al Davis and the Raiders gambled on him as one of their famous reclamation projects. Born in Milwaukee in 1950 and raised in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, Matuszak became a driving force on Oakland's Super Bowl XI and Super Bowl XV championship defenses, embodying the outlaw image of the team so completely that even his own coach called him the goods. After football, Matuszak became a working actor, most famously playing the deformed pirate Sloth beneath 5 hours of makeup in 1985's The Goonies, following years of struggling openly with alcohol and cocaine that he detailed in his own 1987 memoir, Cruisin' with the Twos. On June 17, 1989, Matuszak collapsed at his North Hollywood home and died en route to the hospital. The Los Angeles County coroner ruled the cause an accidental overdose of the prescription painkiller Darvocet, complicated by an enlarged heart and pneumonia, with traces of cocaine found in his system that were not considered a direct cause of death. He was 38 years old. Twos spent his career embodying the Raiders' reckless, no-holds-barred identity on screen and off it. John Matuszak's own heart gave out at 38, the same year Hollywood was still selling children on the gentle monster hiding underneath his real face. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe, because the next man on this list spent as many years fighting for players like these 4 as he once spent playing beside them. 5 is the Hall of Fame guard who left the field to spend the next quarter century deciding, for better and for worse, what football owed the men who played it. Gene Upshaw anchored the Raiders' offensive line for 15 seasons, becoming the only player in NFL history to reach the Super Bowl with the same franchise in 3 different decades, winning championships in 1977 and 1981. Born in Robstown, Texas in 1945, Upshaw played his college football at Tiny Texas A, and before Oakland made him a first-round pick in 1967, and he retired in 1983 having missed almost no games across his entire career. He was immediately elected executive director of the NFL Players Association, a position he held for 25 years, leading players through the bitter 1987 strike and the antitrust litigation that eventually won the modern era of free agency, building the union's assets from $4 million in debt to more than $200 million. That legacy carried real weight and real controversy, as the science connecting football to CTE and long-term brain damage began surfacing in the 2000s. A growing number of retired players, including Hall of Famer Joe DeLamielleure, accused Upshaw of ignoring their disability claims and medical needs while the union's finances grew. Upshaw responded bluntly that his obligation was to active, dues-paying players, not retirees, a stance that permanently divided his legacy among the very men his own career had once represented on the field. In mid-August of 2008, Upshaw began having trouble breathing at his home near Lake Tahoe, California. His wife convinced him to go to the emergency room, where doctors diagnosed him with an aggressive, advanced pancreatic cancer. Gene Upshaw died 2 days later, on August 20th, 2008, at age 63, one of the fastest diagnosis-to-death timelines his own union's medical director had ever seen. The NFL had all 32 teams wear a patch bearing his initials that opening weekend. Upshaw spent 15 years protecting quarterbacks and 25 more deciding which former players the league's money would protect. Gene Upshaw died only 2 days after the cancer that killed him was even found, leaving behind a fight over the very question of who football owes that outlived him by years. If Upshaw's story is the one that got you, tell me in the comments which member of this team hit you hardest, because the last man on this list is still alive and still fighting. Only the fight isn't against another team anymore. 6 is the Hall of Fame receiver whose greatest catch came off the field entirely, turning a father's worst nightmare into a mission that has outlasted his playing career by decades. Fred Biletnikoff spent 14 seasons as one of the most sure-handed receivers in football history, winning Super Bowl 11 MVP honors with the Raiders and building a reputation for precise, unspectacular routes that made him nearly impossible to cover despite lacking breakaway speed. Born in Erie, Pennsylvania in 1943, Biletnikoff starred at Florida State before signing with Oakland on the field immediately after the 1965 Gator Bowl, going on to a Hall of Fame career and a second act as the team's wide receivers coach from 1989 to 2007. In February of 1999, Biletnikoff's 20-year-old daughter Tracy, who had struggled with drug addiction before turning her life around to become a substance abuse counselor herself, was strangled to death by her boyfriend at the treatment center where she worked. Her body found in a ravine in Redwood City, California. Her killer was eventually convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 55 years to life. Biletnikoff channeled his grief into the Biletnikoff Foundation, and in 2015, opened Tracy's Place of Hope in Loomis, California, a residential home for teenage girls battling addiction and abuse, funded in part by Raiders owner Mark Davis. He is alive today, in his early 80s, walking with the help of a cane from an old football injury, still showing up in person to meet the girls his daughter's memory continues to house. Biletnikoff once made his living catching passes other men couldn't reach. Fred Biletnikoff has spent the last quarter-century catching young women other families couldn't save, in the name of the daughter football never got the chance to protect. They rest now in an Alabama churchyard, in an Oregon home overlooking the mountains he loved, in a heart that finally gave out after decades of losing pieces of itself, in a Los Angeles hospital record that closed on a 38-year-old giant, and in a Lake Tahoe emergency room where a diagnosis and a death arrived only 2 days apart. One is still walking with a cane into a house named after his daughter, still catching what he can. The Raiders built an entire dynasty on renegades nobody else wanted. And 40 years later, the bill for that reputation is still, one name at a time, coming due in full.